So here we're going to begin talking about the big family of shapes known as quadrilaterals or four-sided shapes. So all of these shapes under the umbrella of quadrilaterals have four sides. Everything listed in here is a four-sided shape. That is the main property. That's basically how we define quadrilaterals, but then properties follow from that definition. Really, only one property follows here, and it's that our internal angles add up to 360 degrees. So if I draw a random quadrilateral, these four angles inside add up to 360 degrees every time. And if I can call these shapes quadrilaterals, that property also applies to them. That's an important idea, that everything under this umbrella inherits that property. It inherits really the definition and all the properties that follow. So when we talk about these different shapes under that umbrella, really we're thinking mostly about the opposite and consecutive sides and angles. Basically how all of the different angles and sides in these shapes relate to each other. And a second part that we're going to draw on our own, and that's called the diagonal. So going from one corner to the opposite corner, that's a diagonal. And I also want to think about how these two diagonals relate. Because you can see when I draw those two diagonals, I have some triangles in here. So the stuff that we learned about triangles in our last unit is really going to apply directly to the relationships that we see between these angles, the sides, and the diagonals that we draw. And one more time, just to reiterate, any property that applies to the bigger umbrella, let's say parallelograms, also applies to anything under that, just the same way it works with quadrilaterals. This has four sides and 360 degrees for its internal angles, so everything under that, everything in that family, also has that property. So this is just another way to visualize the relationships between quadrilaterals here. This is more showing how properties are passed down from the top. So properties of quadrilaterals get passed down to everything beneath that. Properties of a rectangle, like having four right angles, gets passed down to a square. So everything that's downstream inherits properties from above. This is actually exactly the same thing that we saw on that previous screen. I think the previous screen has a better way of showing kind of naming of shapes. So if I say a shape is a rectangle, I also know that that's a parallelogram. It's under this family group, and it's a quadrilateral. It's under that whole group of shapes. So I think it's easier to kind of think about how we name shapes from this, and how all rectangles are parallelograms, and all squares, everything that's in here, is also in this rectangle bubble. So kind of talking about the naming conventions, whereas I think this diagram shows how the properties are passed down from the top down. Let me get one more example of that. Parallelograms, the key feature there is that opposite sides are parallel. So these two are opposite and they're parallel to each other. These two are opposite and they're parallel. That gets passed down to both a rhombus and to a rectangle. So these arrows are indicating that properties get passed down. The easiest one is that all of these are quadrilaterals. Every shape under the umbrella or downstream of quadrilaterals gets that same property of four sides. And then everything that's downstream of parallelograms gets the property that comes with parallelograms, which is opposite sides being parallel. So these are just general ways of looking at the relationships between quadrilaterals. In the next video, I'm going to get into specific ones and see how they tie into other ones that we'll learn about.